So this is a painting called The School of Athens, and it's a painting by Raphael, and the painting is in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican, or Rome, you could say. And it really is an incredible painting, and it's really a painting that I am very fond of. It's very close to the famous painting of um, uh, God and Adam painted on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. And this was painted during the Renaissance, as I said, by Raphael. He was painting this as Leonardo da Vinci was painting this other famous painting on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. And they went over to speak with each other from time to time. And I'll tell you something about that now, but it's one of the great paintings of the Renaissance, and as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the great paintings of all time. So here's a picture of me visiting the this painting. It's, as I said, in the Sistine Chapel. And now I want to get to this painting. If you don't know yet, yes, there we go, Andre. It's the School of Athens by Raphael. If you don't know the painting, it's a painting of the ancient Greek philosophers. And there are some images online with the names added to all of them. People have been trying to figure out who is who and what does this painting depict. And all the major or the most famous, or at least most of the most famous ancient Greek philosophers are on there. But if you zoom in a little bit, you would see in the middle are Plato and Aristotle. Now, I mentioned the story about Raphael and Da Vinci because the story goes that he was so inspired, Raphael, by the work that his friend Leonardo da Vinci was doing next door, that he has decided to use Da Vinci's face for that of Plato in this painting. So we don't know what Plato actually looked like. He lived several hundred years before Christ, but the face that you see there on Plato is actually the face of Leonardo da Vinci. And another interesting thing about this painting is there's a lot of symbolism in this, with, as is the case with all of these great Renaissance paintings, that you'll see Plato is pointing upwards and Aristotle is sort of pointing or gesturing towards the earth. And there's a reason for this. It's because obviously, as you probably know, Aristotle was a student of Plato. Plato was a student of Socrates. And if you compare the works of Plato to Aristotle, you would see that Plato, most of the time, or much of his philosophy, is concerned with understanding the cosmos, trying to make sense of heaven and earth, trying to make sense of the way things are, how the universe or the earth was created, and all these bigger picture transcendent issues. He did speak about politics and ethics and so forth as well, but there's a bigger theme in Plato, which is trying to make sense of what we are and how we came here and so forth. And then a lot of Aristotle's work has to do with more practical stuff, trying to understand the earth, trying to understand human nature, trying to understand politics, ethics, and so forth. And so what I want to say about this painting that really is significant, and I regret not noticing this earlier, is if you look at these two philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, you will see that each of them is holding a book. And the names of the books are actually written on there. On Plato's book, you can see the words Timeo, and on Aristotle, it says Etika. That is, of course, because Plato wrote a very famous book called Timeo, or Timaeus, as we know it today, and Aristotle wrote a very famous book called the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, when we think of Plato today, we don't think of Timaeus. We don't think of that book. We think of the Republic. When we think of Aristotle, we think of a wide variety of books that he has published, including the Nicomachean Ethics, including Politeia, or the Politics, including physics, metaphysics, and so forth. But there's a reason why these two books are highlighted on this particular painting. It's because these two books have played such a significant role during the Middle Ages in the run-up to the Renaissance when this was painted. And so here's just a picture of my own shelf. I'm very proud of my book collection, and these are the books I have on Greek philosophy. I think this is all of them. And at least you will see there's a whole bunch written by Aristotle. I think you can see here the politics, the metaphysics, Nicomachean ethics, the Athenian constitution, the anima or on the soul, poetics, physics, and there are some others as well. I think psychology or something is another book. Aristotle wrote a whole bunch of books, and Plato, I actually don't see the Republic. Oh, there we go. The Republic is here as well, which is Plato's best known book, and today, together with the Laws. But you'll see there's a thin book next to it, to the right of the Republic, that says Timaeus and Crito. Those two are, there we go, let's get back to this. Those two are usually read together. Now, I want to say something about Timaeus, because it's today not a very well-known book, but it was it was an incredibly influential book during the Middle Ages, when people really started studying Plato. And I should stop myself here and say there's a reason why, before I get into Timaeus, why I chose this topic to share some ideas with you. It's because I've noticed over the last few weeks and days that on my timeline on Twitter and some of the comments on YouTube, that some people have been asking about this whole thing of calling ourselves Westerners, and why do we call ourselves Westerners? And what does it mean to be part of Western civilization? And there's a very good reason why a lot of people have become frustrated with the notion of the West. It's because when they think of the West, they think of all the crazy stuff that's happening in the West right now. They think of wokeness, they think of the left, they think of all these crazy ideas that have developed over the last few hundred years, but especially the last few decades: critical race theory, Black Lives Matter. They think about rainbow flags and trans flags, and the opening ceremony to the Paris Olympics. And people are very annoyed with what the West has become. They are disconnected with Western governments and so forth. But I think it's wrong to use this as an image of what constitutes the West. Because the West has been something that it's not very easy to define, but there's a very clear image that we can create of what it means to be Western and what Western civilization used to be, that has developed not over decades, not over centuries, but over millennia, over thousands of years, including hundreds of years before the birth of Christ even. And recently this has become contaminated. So one way to think of this is to think of ourselves as fish swimming in water. And this is actually an analogy that my friend Ernst van Zyl, whom I mentioned earlier, has mentioned. So with credit to him. And once the fish gets out of the water, suddenly you realize that you miss the water. But the water that we are swimming in has become contaminated. And we have reason to be very concerned about this. But the fact that the water has become contaminated doesn't mean that the water is the problem. It means that the contamination is the problem. And it's the same with Western tradition. Western tradition and what it means to be Western has become contaminated. But that doesn't mean that the notion of Western tradition is the problem. It's much rather the solution to the problem than it is the source of the problem. I hope you are with me on that, and I'm going to be talking about this a bit more. So let's get back to Timaeus. So this is an incredible book. It's not a very thick book. It's a pretty easy book to read. And what really is significant about this book is, remember, the ancient Greek philosophers lived 400 years BC, some of them even more before that. And one of the major themes of the Greek philosophers was that they were trying to figure out the earth. They were trying to figure out how things are so that we can understand this world that we live in. Why do people act in a particular way? Why do people think in a particular way or respond to things in a particular way? And so a recurring theme in Greek philosophy, which you can also see in Roman philosophy and in Middle Ages Christian philosophy as well, is the whole theme of nature. And so nature doesn't simply mean trees and rivers and mountains. Nature means, you might say, the way things are. So every particular thing has a nature, or in Afrikaans you can say, let me just put this off. In Afrikaans you could say a art, or the way it is. And so they were trying to figure out the nature of things. And so one way to think of philosophy, and it's a bit oversimplified, but to think of the difference between bad philosophy and good philosophy is that good philosophy seeks to understand the way things are. Good philosophy recognizes that the world is complex, that we cannot reduce it to simplicity through theory and so forth. We should try to understand the complexity. And in the process, we can try to develop theories as long as our theories are aimed at understanding and not at prescribing. And bad philosophy, the type of philosophy we've had in recent decades and centuries, is not about understanding how things are, but prescribing how things ought to be. And a very good example of this, of course, is Marxism. Marx had this incredible theory that the world would be a wonderful place if every person works according to his abilities and receives according to his needs. Now that sounds incredible. It's a very good theory, but the problem with that theory is it's not compatible with nature. It's not compatible with human nature and the way people are. And so what Marxism then tries to do is to enforce its theory onto reality, to try to change reality to adapt to its theory or its ideology. When what they ought to be doing, what Marxists ought to be doing, and any ideologue ought to be doing, is to adapt their ideology or their theory to reality, to see how things really are, and then change their ideology or their theory if it's not compatible with reality. And so this is a very prominent theme in philosophy today, which is why modern contemporary philosophy has become very bad philosophy, because it's aimed at being original. Everything has to be original, everything has to be new, everything has to be directed at changing things, and everything has to be directed at progress, in quotation marks, of course. And progress today doesn't mean really making things better, it simply means moving away from our tradition. Which is why it's so important to look at what our tradition really is. And so this brings us to Timaeus. And the incredible thing about Timaeus is it's Plato's attempt to try to understand God, to try to understand the creation. And so some theologians have remarked that some sections of Timaeus reads like a commentary on Genesis. And Plato tried, it's a work of philosophy, and he is, again, not trying to prescribe how things ought to be, but he's trying to figure out how things are. How did the world come to be? Why do people act in a certain way, and so forth? And Plato comes to the conclusion that the only way to really make sense of this is to realize or recognize that there must be a creator. There must be a being that is above or outside of what we regard as reality, as material things, who came before everything we know today, that created this universe. And so this is really spectacular because a lot of what Plato says in Timaeus could be compared to the New Testament. Again, some people have said it could be read as a commentary on Genesis, because it's trying to figure out how the world came to be just through using logic, the logic that they had available at the time. And so he makes this conclusion. And there were a lot of things in ancient Greek philosophy that the early Christians were uncomfortable with, the fact that they were pagans and so forth. But somewhere during the Middle Ages, the Christian philosophers started to realize how much they actually have in common with what the ancient Greeks said. And so especially someone like Thomas Aquinas said that, with reference to Aristotle, that you can interpret Aristotle from a Christian perspective and then still use Aristotle and Plato and so forth. And so Plato has, through a work like this, played a significant role in bringing Christianity and Athenian philosophy together, which is really remarkable. And so I want to, I see there's a question about books by Hobbes and Locke. We might get to that later. So this brings me to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle wrote, as I mentioned, a whole bunch of books that are really incredible. But I want to say something about the Nicomachean Ethics, because this is the other book that is depicted in the painting. If you tuned in just now, I'll just show you this picture again. It's let's just zoom out, the School of Athens. And if you zoom into Plato and Aristotle, you would see Plato is holding a book called Timaeus, and Aristotle is holding a book called Ethica, which is a reference to this book, the Nicomachean Ethics. Now, a lot could be said about this book. It's quite significantly thicker than Timaeus, but this is really an incredible book. And as far as I'm concerned, probably the best book that you can read on ethics. And there are a few things in this book that really shaped the way the West thinks about the world. Now, let me just make a remark in passing that it's difficult to try to define what is Western tradition and Western civilization, because a lot of things that are unique to the West are not exclusive to the West. In other words, one of the the best, or one of the most significant characteristics of Western tradition is that Westerners were always people of the book, people who spent a lot of time reading books and writing books and collecting books and so forth. But this doesn't mean, obviously, that Westerners are the only people who read books or who write books. Western tradition is typically associated with Christianity as one of the founding blocks, if not the foundation of Western tradition. But this doesn't mean that only Westerners are Christians. But there's a certain way of thinking that could be associated with Western tradition. And again, I'm not referring to what the West has become, but to what the West has always been. And so one of the very important aspects of being Western was the notion of gratitude, which you might also describe as one of the building blocks of being Western, of living in gratitude, which is why the concept of privilege is today regarded as something evil, but it is something that has in Western tradition been regarded as something that every person has to a greater or lesser extent. And having privilege is regarded in our tradition, in the Western tradition, as something to be grateful for. And that's the biblical notion if you read the New Testament, but it also came through especially in the works of Aristotle, but also Plato and the Roman philosophers, Cicero and so forth, that we ought to live in gratitude. We need to be grateful for all these wonderful things we have inherited that we don't deserve. The wonderful things that we have inherited as a result of the sacrifices of the people who were here before us. And so in a contemporary way, you could express this by saying that if you have inherited something, literally, if you have inherited money, to use it to state it in very bland and superficial terms, that is something that you should be grateful for. And you should spend your life living as someone who is grateful for what you have inherited. Or if you have inherited something else, a house and so forth. But the important things that we inherit are not necessarily measured in terms of its monetary value. The important things we inherit are things like culture, like the language we speak, the history that we are a part of, and so forth. And we might say that this constitutes privilege. And to have privilege is a wonderful thing. It's something that you should be grateful for. But in today's world, in this anti-Western world that we live in, having privilege is regarded as an evil thing, as something that ought to be destroyed. And this is as a result of these theories and ideologies that seek to change reality, to adopt reality to fit with their own ideological prescriptions. And so gratitude is an important thing that comes through in Aristotle's work. And another point that comes through in Aristotle's work, which is also you might say, a building block of Western civilization, and also something that is under threat today, is the notion of balance, of approaching things in a balanced way and being very cautious of any of the extremes. And recognizing, when we talk about balance, that all things are connected, that you cannot simply categorize reality up to the point where you regard things as disconnected from each other. And so we can explain this in many ways, but one way to explain it is economics, for example, modern economics. Economics is a complicated thing, and it has different spheres, but if we fail to recognize that all these different aspects of economics are tied to each other, all form one big unity or a whole, then we would be surprised to see that when we tamper with one aspect of the economy, it will have consequences on all the other aspects as well. But it doesn't just go for economics, it goes for what it means to be a nation, what it means to have a particular tradition, and so forth. And so one of the major themes in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics is this theme of balance, which he explains as the golden mean. And so the point that Aristotle makes in this book, which again is very significant because it was one of the main thoughts or ideas that shaped the way the West came to be, was that any particular idea, whether it's a good idea or any particular good idea rather, could be pushed into or pulled into an extreme, and then it becomes a bad idea. So, and you can think of many examples. One is courage. Courage is a good example. If you have too much courage, you become reckless. If you have too little courage, you are a coward. And so any good term that you can think of, if you have too much of it, it becomes dangerous. If you have too little of it, it becomes dangerous as well. And this, by the way, is every conversation of like this in some way references Adolf Hitler. But this is one of the, I think, a more conservative traditional critique of Nazism and why it went wrong. There's no debate as to whether it was an evil ideology and whether it inflicted evil on the world, but there is somewhat of a debate to try to make sense of it and to see what exactly is the source of this evil. We all know what happened and how evil that was, but what is the source of the problem? And one of the many things that went wrong during the previous century is people identified certain things that they regarded as good, and they disconnected these things from all the other. So in someone like, and this is not my own argument, I'm quoting, I believe it was Charles Taylor who mentioned this, that the problem with, or one of the many problems with someone like Adolf Hitler was that he identified pride in the community as a good thing. And to say that isn't wrong. It's true that having a sense of pride in your community is a good thing. But then taking that to the extreme naturally implies disconnecting it from the balance with other things that you have to consider. And you cannot disconnect it from other things, a sense of virtue, morality, and so forth, without inflicting evil. And so Aristotle makes an argument, a very strong argument, for finding balance in everything we do. And then there's something else about Plato and Aristotle that I want to mention. Sometimes if you read some works on philosophy, it is Plato and Aristotle are presented as somehow two sides of a debate, as if we have to choose, are we on Plato's side or on Aristotle's side, because there were some things on which they disagreed. And this I want to talk about is one thing on which there was some disagreement between Plato and Aristotle. But this doesn't mean that they were on two different sides of the debate. The more appropriate way to think about this is that they were both part of a cohesive whole, and that they argued different sides of the same thing. Again, going back to this question of balance. So why is this painting or this picture so important? It's because both Plato and Aristotle tried to make sense of the human soul, the issue of consciousness, and what it means to be a human, and how are we different from animals. And Plato had this incredible metaphor in a book called Phaedrus, which we know as the chariot, the two-horsed chariot. And so Plato's argument or conclusion was that the human soul could be described as consisting of three parts. And these three parts are symbolized with the picture of the painting of this chariot. And the three parts are our rational side, our rationality or reason. That's one aspect of what it means to be human, of having a soul. The other is our desires, or our behoeftes, as we call it in Afrikaans. And the other is the spiritedness. Now, the Greek words for our rationality is the nous. The ancient Greek word for our desires is the epithumia, and then for the spiritedness is the thumos. Now, Plato went as far as saying that the soul could be found, these three parts could be found in different parts of the body. The reason or the rational side of who we are is found in our heads, in our brain, of course. Our desires are in the lower parts of the body, the stomach, and of course our sexual desires, and all of that is included in this. Things that we simply have a desire for. And then the thumos, or the spiritedness, which might be described as higher desires, desire to be part of something bigger, is found in the chest, in the heart. And so Plato's argument, without going into too much detail, is that these three parts of the soul could be described as a chariot. And so the reason in Plato's analysis, the rational side is the charioteer. And the spiritedness is symbolized by this white horse that's trying to fly upwards towards the sky. And the desires, the lower desires, you might say, is depicted by this dark horse. And so Plato said that our higher desires, or our spiritedness, patriotism, the desire to contribute to the greater good, these things are pulling us upwards, but some of our more sinful desires are pulling us downwards. And it's the duty of the charioteer to try to maintain these two, to maintain a balance between these two. Aristotle had a slightly different view on this. He said that it's not so much our rational side that is driving the soul, that the soul isn't guided by our rationality, but rather by the thumos, by the spiritedness. And so our spiritedness, our desire to be part of something that is bigger than ourselves, our desire to do good, our desire to contribute to something other than ourselves, our patriotic side, these things are what drives us. And that our spiritedness has to maintain a balance between our rationality and our, what you might call, lower desires. Now, there's some debate between these two about how do we describe or define the human soul, but the fascinating thing is that they agree on these three parts of the soul and what it means to be human. And so that brings me to the last book I want to say something about, a book called Identity by Francis Fukuyama, which was published, I believe, in 2018. And this is a fascinating book. You might know Francis Fukuyama as a highly respected political scientist who is today often ridiculed, and people make fun of the end of history thesis that he presented in the 90s, when he argued that the fall of the Berlin Wall would mean that the world would standardize on liberal democracy, that we might have reached the end of history, in the sense that we have developed up to our final point. We have found the solution, and the solution is liberalism and liberal democracy. And so Fukuyama wrote this book in 2018, and he starts by referencing the election of Donald Trump and Brexit, which happened in 2016, and the events after the 9/11 tragedy in New York City. And then Fukuyama asks the question, but why are things they are? Why is liberalism failing? Of course, and he is writing this book as a liberal thinker and someone who regards this as the solution. But his approach was to be critical of the ideology that he prefers, to try to figure out what is the problem here. And Fukuyama takes this back to the chariot, the allegory of the chariot. And he says that he thinks in this book, Identity, one of the main reasons why these modern ideologies, and liberal democracy in particular, isn't succeeding or thriving to the extent that people hoped it would during the 90s, is that it has forgotten about a very important part of what it means to be human. It has forgotten about 1/3 of the human soul, if we compare this to the way it was described by Plato and Aristotle. And so he references Plato's description of the chariot. And Fukuyama reaches the conclusion that the problem with these modern ideologies is that it has a very strong focus on rationalism, on being rational, on having reason, And you can see this in all the incredible arguments and the emphasis on the battle of ideas and so forth, free speech and all of this. There's a very strong emphasis on having rational arguments and being rational. The law must be rational. Our arguments must be rational. And other than that, there's a very strong emphasis on the lower desires, saying that freedom implies that you should arrange your life in the way you think is best, which implies, and this is somewhat facetiously, but implies that you should be able to smoke what you want and drink what you want. And as Steven Pinker has remarked, freedom necessarily implies the freedom to destroy your own life. Now, the classical or traditional Western way of thinking about freedom certainly does not imply the freedom to destroy your own life. So someone who destroys his own life through bad decisions, through becoming dependent on whether it's a substance or a particular behavior and so forth, through addictions and so forth, is certainly not a free person, but a slave. This is very explicitly stated in the New Testament, in the letters of Paul, but it's also in the arguments of Plato and Aristotle and Cicero and the Roman philosophers as well, that freedom is tied to doing good, that we are free when we do good, and when we do bad things, even though we have decided to do these things ourselves, that is not freedom. That is much closer to slavery. And so Fukuyama's concern about how the world has derailed is that these modern ideologies have forgotten about the thumos, have forgotten about our spiritedness, our desire to do good, our sense of belonging, the fact that we instinctively want to be part of something that is bigger than ourselves. That, as our Western tradition has always said, that it's a beautiful death if you make the ultimate sacrifice by sacrificing your life, in other words, your freedom, your individual freedom, for something that is bigger or more important than you. But these modern ideologies have placed the individual and whatever you want to do as the center point of what it means to be free. And so Fukuyama makes the case that if we want liberalism and all the great things that have sprouted from liberalism, like freedom of speech and so forth, if we want these things to survive, we need to rehabilitate this ideology, to put a stronger emphasis on or recognition of the fact that people are political animals, people are communal animals, people are part of communities. But in as far as these ideologies regard community and groupthink, to use this negative term, as something that is evil or something that stands in the way of your individuality, that is not sustainable. It might be a good argument, but again, it is detached from reality. So maybe it's good to stop there. I thought I'd share these ideas with you, mainly because I wanted to, this is the first video I've done like this. I wanted to see if it works during a live video, to share some ideas with pictures coming up on the screen. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can do, of course, other than that as well. I'd like to hear from you, what you think about this. I actually enjoyed doing this video, so if you would like for me to do more videos like this in the future, please let me know. You can let me know in the live stream, or you can let me know, of course, in the comment section of this video once it's published. So thank you very much. Let me go through some of the questions. If there are some questions, I'd love to answer them. Let me just go through some of the comments that came in. There was a question about, I remember now, about John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, and Hegel. Maybe I think it would derail this video if you go too much into that now, but I would really love to do that. And Hobbes and Locke, maybe I could say this. I mentioned the claim that by some people that we should think of Plato and Aristotle as if there's this incredible gap between the two, and that we have to choose one of the two, where the better way to think about Plato and Aristotle is to think of them as more of a cohesive whole. And this might be controversial, but I think that's the proper way to think about Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. We often hear that people need to choose between Hobbes and Locke. Of course, Hobbes was much more of a statist. He had a much stronger preference for a strong government, and Locke, of course, was much more of an individualist and much more cautious of big government. But there are some underlying claims to the philosophy of both Hobbes and Locke that are very similar. Of course, Hobbes' main book is, or most significant book, or most famous book, is the Leviathan, and Hobbes wrote a few. I would say the most best known is 2 treatises on government. But what Hobbes and Locke have in common is that they agree on the state of nature, but they both agree that nature, and remember I mentioned earlier that nature does not simply mean trees and plants and so forth, but the way things are. Nature, in Hobbes' view, is something that we have to escape from. And Hobbes' view is not so antagonistic towards nature, but he's very much convinced that we should move past that. Hobbes has a more optimistic view of the state of nature, but we have progressed out of that. When the classical traditional Western view is that we should always live in harmony with nature. So that's one of the things that these two have in common. Another point that Hobbes and Locke both have in common is their emphasis on contract theory, the social contract, as the way in which the government that we know today, or the modern state, was created, which of course is something that Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a strong emphasis on. And Hobbes and Locke both had a very strong emphasis on being individual, on individualism, and they both in many ways rejected the ideas of Plato and Aristotle and tried to replace these ideas with new ideas. Now, to say these things is controversial, not because it's controversial to criticize Hobbes, but because it's controversial to criticize Locke, because John Locke is regarded today as one of the, what you might call, founding fathers of modern liberalism. But I do think that there's some points in Locke that we should be cautious of. Hobbes has described Greek philosophy and what I mentioned, Plato and Aristotle, very explicitly as vain philosophy. He explicitly rejected it and said that this has to be replaced with new ideas. Locke at least didn't do that, not that explicitly, but his ideas certainly constitute a rejection of Athenian philosophy and Roman philosophy, and you might add Christian philosophy to a significant extent. But I think we can do a video on that. Graham, thank you very much for the super chat. Ernst van Zyl mentioned that the two of you were reading Herman Guillemee's book, The Afrikaners, and discussing what you had learned with each other. Those discussions would make for an interesting series of podcasts. Well, that really is an incredible book. It's probably the most. Well, let me put it this way. I have been asked, of course, this is my own view, what are the most important books on South African history? And it's very difficult to say, and my answer would not be a complete answer, but I would put this as the number one book. Obviously, I am an Afrikaner, and so Samuel Huntington remarked that each civilization sees history with themselves as the center point. So when I think of history, I think of, especially South African history, I think of it from an Afrikaner perspective, when Afrikaners are obviously not the center point of history in South Africa. But this really is an incredible book. Another book that I would highly recommend is Anthea Jeffrey's book, People's War, because it talks about the struggle for the new South Africa and how much of what we know or think we know about the ANC, not simply the post-1994 ANC, but the ANC between the Soweto uprisings and the election of 1994, how much of what we think we know is wrong. It's a very well-researched book. And another book that I think is very good that isn't well known is a book called Anatomy of a Miracle by Patty Waldmeyer. It is, as far as I'm concerned, the best book on the negotiations for the new South Africa during the early 90s. But to get to the comment and the remark of Ernst van Zyl, yes, I've actually started reading the book a while back and I put it down. It is a dense book and it's a slow read. I'm about 1/3 in. I think Ernst has surpassed me. Not I think, I know that he has. And it really is an incredible book. It's one of those books that's really big, really thick, and you have to read it slowly, unfortunately or fortunately, because doing so really enables you to take in what happened. And I am pretty sure that Ernst is planning to do some form of, I think he would do much more than just a video or a podcast episode, but somewhat of a series about Afrikaner history. And I do think that Afrikaner history is being rediscovered, and the Afrikaners are being rediscovered. And I don't want to get into that too much in this video, but I think the pendulum has swung too far to the one side, to the side of regarding the Afrikaners as evil, regarding the ANC and the South African government, the current South African government, as incredible, as God sent, regarding everything that happened after 1990 or before 1994 as evil, and everything that the ANC did at that time as wonderful, and every mistake that the ANC has made since 1994 as excusable. And so I think the pendulum has gone as far as it could, and it has been there for some time, and it's starting to swing back. That a lot of people, it started swinging back in South Africa maybe a decade ago when people started using the word Afrikaner again. It used to be a controversial word in the early 90s. A lot of Afrikaners resigned. People like Max de Pre and some of these publicly resigned, allegedly, claiming that they aren't Afrikaners anymore, which of course I don't think it's that simple. It's funny that some of these people who have resigned suddenly describe themselves as Afrikaners again. And it was just controversial and even inappropriate to call yourself an Afrikaner. But it's not controversial at all anymore to be an Afrikaner. So that's one way in which, that was probably the first sign that the pendulum is swinging back. But we can see that now with our friends abroad who are really interested in what is happening in South Africa and in the culture and the history of the Afrikaner people, and a different perspective on the state of affairs in South Africa than what we typically hear through the media and what we typically hear through the South African government, but also a different perspective on the history of South Africa. So yes, an incredible book, and I think it's something, as I said, I think Ernst will be talking about this in the future. Okay, I want to start rounding off. I think there were 2 new questions that came in. I have not read the book South Africa, The Solution. I have heard of it. I don't have a copy. I don't know where to get it. I can't remember who the author was, but I know someone has recommended that I read the book. So no, but I will keep an eye out for it, especially after you've mentioned it now, Imre. And then there's a comment, do you know of any good books on the Boer Wars in English from the Boer perspective? Well, let me close with this story. I don't think I've told this story publicly. It's something from my conversation with Tucker Carlson in 2018. And I'm sure he wouldn't mind me telling this story. There was a time, in 2018, people reached out to him and said to him, listen, you need to speak about what's happening in South Africa. And I was very happy or honored that people recommended that he interviews me. And so he obviously from AfriForum, I was with AfriForum at the time. And so he reached out to me through someone and said, listen, we want to speak with you. And so we met him. I met him the first time in 2018 at the Fox News studios in Washington, D.C. And so we had a conversation before the interview and after the interview. It's the interview, you'll find it online. And he actually said to us that he was busy reading Pakenham's book. I think the book is just called The Boer War, might be the Anglo-Boer War, which is an English book. I have not read it, I have to say, but I've heard many times that it is sort of the standard work on the Anglo-Boer War. It's not too sympathetic to either side. It tells the story as it is and as it happened. And so Tucker said to us that he grew up learning about the Boer War, but reading this book, he was just interested in the history, that he came to realize that he was very much a victim of the British propaganda at the time. There was a massive propaganda campaign during the war to justify the war and to justify the concentration camps, to say that it's in the Afrikaners' best will, that the Afrikaners are less civilized than the British and all of these things, and that the war is a necessary war and it would be good for us at the end of the day. And Tucker then mentioned that reading this book, which is a very objective, neutral book, the more he read the book, the more he discovered that he has much more sympathy with the Boers than with the British, which I wouldn't say that is the reason, but it might be one of the reasons why he agreed at the time that it was a good idea to to do more about what is happening in South Africa and what's happening on South African farms and so forth. So if you ask me to recommend a book about the Boer War, I would recommend that book, even though I haven't read it. And I know it's it's dangerous to recommend a book without having read it, but I've heard enough good things about it. Some great comments coming in. People talking about the Nice Reitz's book. I assume you're talking about Commando. I haven't read it. I'm looking for it. I actually called a secondhand bookstore to ask them, could you get me a copy of this book? I've heard that it's very good, and I've heard that it's a very good book that you can read to your kids as well, to your children, about the Anglo-Boer War. So maybe that would be yeah, there we go, Commando. The Nice Reitz's book, Commando, a Boer journal, Boer journal of the Boer War. I've also heard that it's a very good book. All right, I think I'll close it with this. We might have another similar chat. I obviously really enjoy books and reading books and talking about books. So we might do one in future where we talk about another book or another section of books, or we might just do an open chat, maybe next Sunday or something like that, where we just discuss some ideas and we recommend some reading material to each other. All right, thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you everyone for watching this video after the live stream, and please drop some comments and I will certainly get back to them. Thank you very much.